I think it was last week or week before last, I saw this open letter from the Eisenhower Media Network talking about how the U.S. should be a force for peace in the world. And it was in relationship to what they see as an escalation of the war in Ukraine, primarily driven by the Biden administration and NATO, that could result into a nuclear holocaust or a nuclear catastrophe. And it reminded me of growing up during the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Um, I was blessed to have a father who served in the U.S. military during World War II, and as a result of that experience, all of his travels from the United States to England to Africa to Europe, he always had a keen interest in global affairs. So these were things that we discussed as a child, and I was just blessed to have his perspective on things. The nuclear threat during that time was very real for us. I remember one day my dad said, "Come on, I want you to ride with me." We rode around Charlotte looking for the bomb shelters because at that time we had bomb shelters. They actually were built in anticipation of a possible nuclear war between what was then the Soviet Union and the United States. And we rode around, identified the bomb shelters, and then I asked my dad, I said, because this is during the era of American apartheid, I said, okay, so we found the bomb shelters. If they start dropping hydrogen bombs on us, do you think the white folks are going to let us in? And of course, he gave me one of his looks. The question was rhetorical. I already knew what the answer was. We didn't have a snowball's chance in southern Hades of getting into the bomb shelters. But it was just something just in case. He wanted me to know that. Uh, we were bombarded during that time because my parents took two newspapers, which they read, basically cover to cover, a morning newspaper and an evening newspaper. And then, unless my dad was out in the spring, summer, and fall working in the garden during the time when the news came on, my parents were watching the news. So they were just people that just wanted to be aware of what was going on. And, I inherited that from them. But we were being told at that time that the Soviet Union, and in particular its leader Nikita Khrushchev, were the devil incarnate. I mean, that's the way the corporate media in the United States made them look. Now, up until that time, uh, I thought the white boys and girls yelling at and spitting on people like Sister Dorothy Counts, who was trying to desegregate Harding High School here in Charlotte, and uh, Jerry Richardson and all of the white folks down in Little Rock who were jeering at students that were trying to desegregate the high schools down there. Up to that point, I thought that they were the most evil people on the planet. And then this Cuban Missile Crisis exploded. Now, now one of the things that people in my generation who were growing up during this time, one of the things, just to show you how real the threat of nuclear war was, uh, they would have us have these drills in elementary school. I'm like 9, 10, 11 years old or something during this time frame. And the nuclear drill was get under your desk, as if that was going to prevent us from radiation if a nuclear a thermonuclear bomb exploded. But of course, it was a different era in terms of whatever the teacher said went. There was no questioning or whatever. But most people had a quizzical look on their face to the extent that they understood it. And I might have been blessed more than a lot of people just to have parents like mine kept that pointed me towards being aware of things that were going on in the world. So in October 1962, this missile crisis reached a point of virtual explosion. And unbeknownst to me and probably everyone else, this person that had been demonized, Nikita Khrushchev, and his U.S. ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin, were negotiating a peaceful settlement to the missile crisis with President John F. Kennedy and his closest advisor, his brother, Robert F. Kennedy. And they reached a compromise. Now, no one had talked it, and we didn't even know anything about this till many years later. Nobody even knew that the United States had at least it wasn't being discussed in the media, just the same way this war in Ukraine, that all the reporting is one-sided. The United States had missiles in Turkey. And this is before the expansion of NATO, right, into to its current levels, because the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union, is still in place at this time. The United States had missiles in Turkey that the Russians wanted, or the Soviets wanted removed. And of course, the United States wanted the missiles in Cuba removed. And so they compromised. Common sense prevailed and humanity was saved. Compare that to the situation that we're faced with today, where we have experts like the director of the Eisenhower Media Network, Dennis Fritz. They are more. He says that he spent all his life in working in the Pentagon. He's more concerned about the threat of nuclear war now.
Amy, I must tell you, I spent a few years at the time, Space Command, where our land-based missile systems were under the commander who I advised at the time. I was also, as part of an additional duty, an advisor to the NATO commander. Not the NATO commander, I'm sorry, but the NORAD commander. And I can tell you, I've been in and out of the Pentagon since the age of 22. Now I'm now 66 years old. The majority of my life has been in and out of the Pentagon. And this is probably the most fearful I've ever been with a nuclear escalation. We're talking about two nuclear powers. We're talking about a country, that country being Russia, who for years we have tried to humiliate by way of us. We won the Cold War. We're the only superpower. We do as we please. Well, I can tell you right now, Russia loves their country as well. And, I must be quite frank again, we are the only country to ever use an atomic weapon or a nuclear weapon on another country. I don't think Russia will sit back and let us be the first to do that again. And so I take their threat of not taking off their plate the use of nuclear weapons, I take that seriously. And so that is why, once again, we thought it was so important for us to send that open letter out to the president. And so our hope is to educate the American public so that they could see how we got to this point.
After this open letter.
So that's Dennis Fritz. He's a former command master sergeant in the U.S. Air Force, and as he said, he went into the Air Force, started working in the Pentagon when he was 22 years old. He's now retired, and I don't have his military experience, obviously, but he just says that based on all of the things that he has experienced, working in, Space Command and other places, how much of a concern the current situation is. Now, what we have seen as a result of this escalation, we have seen the Biden administration, for example, has spent nearly $115 billion, has sent that much money to the government in Ukraine so that they could fight this war. The war is, in fact, a proxy war between NATO, primarily the United States, and Russia. And the concern is without any intelligence or rational thinking or common sense, what this could lead to. The United States has nuclear capable weapons in Poland and Romania, which can reach Moscow in about 7 minutes. 7 minutes. That's all the time they would have to respond to a particular nuclear weapon launched from Poland or Romania. So as a result of this, just last week, Moscow, Russia, announced that they were moving nuclear weapons into Belarus. Now, as you can see from the map, Belarus is on the border with Poland. Poland is a NATO country, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a signee to the NATO treaty. And not only that, but do you have, the Russian nuclear weapons being moved, into Belarus, but Russia also has nuclear capable submarines that can find their way off the Atlantic or the Pacific coast of the United States. So you see how dangerous this situation is. I'll read a couple of things that I have written here. The war in eastern Ukraine, which has been raging since 2014, exploded in February 2022 when Russia launched an invasion after several attempts by President Vladimir Putin, to negotiate a settlement with the Biden administration, which failed. Over the past year, the war has escalated into a proxy war between NATO and Russia. Finally, a group of U.S. national security experts, the Eisenhower Media Network, who are more concerned for humanity than with profits for the military-industrial complex, have emerged. Contrast their critical thinking to the unbalanced rhetoric and policies of President Biden and the political morons in Washington, D.C. The Eisenhower Network produced an open letter which calls for a swift diplomatic end to the war in Ukraine. It calls that war an unmitigated disaster and cautions that future devastation could be exponentially greater as nuclear powers creep closer and closer towards open war. This is a statement by the Eisenhower Network. In diplomacy, one must attempt to see with strategic empathy, seeking to understand one's adversaries. This is what Kennedy and Khrushchev did, okay? This is not a weakness, it's wisdom. Since 2007, Russia has repeatedly warned that NATO's armed forces on Russian borders were intolerable. Okay, and you can see how close they are, particularly when they moved into the Baltic states there with, Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia. So Latvia, I always mess that country up for some reason. Where was that? Okay. In diplomacy, one must attempt to see with strategic empathy, seeking to understand one's adversaries. This is not a weakness, it is wisdom. Since 2007, Russia has repeatedly warned that NATO's armed forces on the Russian borders were intolerable, just as Russian forces in Mexico or Canada would be intolerable to the U.S. Now, or as Soviet missiles in Cuba were intolerable to the U.S., during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. So, this is another chart they produce, which shows this is what it must look like to Russia. And what they're saying here is, how would the United States respond if Russia and China had ballistic missiles in Canada and in Mexico? Okay, President Biden has vowed that his administration will continue to aid Ukraine for as long as it takes. They have this saying, fight to the last Ukrainian. In other words, they're going to kill all of them. I mean, just use them for cannon fodder. The Eisenhower Network fear that Biden's position is a recipe for escalation that could result in a nuclear catastrophe. Former U.S. Command Dennis Fritz. Okay, so you've already heard what Fritz had to say, and the most critical thing he said was this particular situation is the most fearful he's ever been with a nuclear escalation. Um, the letter also states 66 years ago, or 60 years ago, President Kennedy made an observation that is crucial to our survival today. Kennedy said, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of the collective death wish for the world. And so, that's a very important point, because during the Cuban Missile Crisis, neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev wanted to push one another, back one another into a corner. Okay, that's basically what they're saying here, is that you don't want to leave your adversary with an option of either just massive death for all, or humiliating retreat. You have to give your adversaries some room to negotiate. So that's basically what they're saying, and of course that is not what's happening with the Biden administration, with the administrations, particularly in France and the United Kingdom, and Germany also appears to just be a puppet on the string of the United States. In fact, Germany now has gone into a recession economically because of the loss of all of the cheap energy that they were getting from Russia. The United States has pushed Germany into a recession. So I don't know how much people in Europe are going to take as a result of these asinine policies by their leaders. But I think it's a real possibility that what you could get is a rise of another fascist dictatorship, because the right wing in a lot of these countries, the hard right in a lot of these countries, is much more powerful than they are here in the United States, or at least as much as they've shown. So finally, NATO expansion in sum is the key feature of a militarized U.S. foreign policy characterized by unilateralism, featuring regime change and preemptive wars. Failed wars, most recently in Iraq and Afghanistan, have produced slaughter and further confrontation, a harsh reality of America's own making. The Russia-Ukraine war has opened a new arena of confrontation and slaughter. This reality is not entirely of our own making, yet it may well be our undoing unless we dedicate ourselves to forging a diplomatic settlement that stops the killing and diffuses tensions. So my question, that I'm posing is, can the gullible American body politic gather its wits to the extent that it has any and demand an end to this madness, or will we be like sheep led to slaughter by political morons? That's where we are. Young people rose up in the 1960s and 70s against the war in Vietnam, and we have a situation now that is potentially far more dangerous. Somehow this madness must cease.